At QDMA, we certainly are big proponents of, fair chase hunting. So we do not support anything that gives us an unfair advantage over our wildlife that we're chasing. And I personally don't think that the game cameras do that. It's nice, I believe, that every state, with the exception of Arizona, allows regular game cameras, those that cannot text. And it's not that they don't allow it. It's under review right now. They're considering not allowing them. But the texting part, yeah, you guys there in New Hampshire are one of just a couple states that don't allow that. And even that, I disagree with that. I don't think even the texting capability gives you an unfair advantage. I do understand where that argument comes from, but just because you know of an animal was at a certain place doesn't mean that you can sneak in on it to that tree or that spot or whatever and harvest it.
Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 251. Kip Adams, The Whitetail Report, Part 2. Deer Issues and Trends. Support for the Big Buck Registry and the Deer Hunt Podcast comes from Hunter's Blend Coffee, imported directly from family farms, roasted and brought to you by hunters who support the hunting industry. Polar Works Coolers and the Chill Zone, specializing in the most durable, reliable thermal cups and coolers. Keep your drinks hot or cold in any element. Black Ash Outdoor Products reduce your risk of tree stand suspension trauma with the Tree Stand Wingman, the Tree Stand Emergency Descender System. Covert Scouting Cameras, remote cameras for hunting, wildlife, and security. The Horny Buck Seed Company. It's all about the freshest seed. Morse's Sporting Goods, a full line of sporting goods without the sales tax. And Big Buck merch. You can get cool, high-quality Big Buck t-shirts, long-sleeve t-shirts, and hoodies. And show support for this podcast by visiting www.bigbuckregistry.com/MERCH. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
Hi, this is Ben Rising with Whitetail Edge. Sit tight as you're about to listen to the best podcast that you possibly can listen to, the Big Buck Registry Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hey, this is Don Higgins from Higgins Outdoors and Real World Wildlife Products. Tune in and hear one of my favorite podcasts, the Big Buck Registry.
Hey, this is Travis T-Bone Turner with Bone Collector and Realtree Road Trip, and you're about to listen to another great episode of the Big Buck Registry Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow predators. My name is Jay, and thank you for tuning in to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. For Dusty Phillips and Jim Keller and the entire staff here at the Big Buck Registry, welcome to this week's show. There are a couple things I'd like you to do for us if you could. If you would, please check us out on iTunes, subscribe, and leave us a review. With your help, we're going to try and push this show up the iTunes charts. I know we have a lot of listeners out there, and I need you to take some action. I need you to leave a review and subscribe to the show. If you do subscribe, that'll give you access and notification each and every week that a new show is released. You can also access this show in its entirety on YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. It's all right there for you to access on demand at your fingertips. Regarding the harness program, we have an ample supply of harnesses to give away from our volunteer donors. If you're in need of a full-body harness, please send an email to jay@bigbuckregistry.com. We pick up where we left off last week with further discussion of the QDMA's 2018 Whitetail Report with Director of Conservation Kip Adams. This time we discuss current deer-related issues and trends like legality of crossbow use, cellular trail cameras, drones, CWD prevalence, testing and cost, top hunter land management practices, hunter numbers, deer tag requirements, venison donation programs, state deer management plans, and lawsuits. We'll turn to our entire interview with Kip Adams in just one moment, but before we do, let's hear from our friends at Polar Works Coolers and Jim Keller with the Deer News. Folks, I want to tell you about one of the best coolers I've found for the price in quite a while. I was with my family the other day, and I couldn't believe the price on the cooler I was looking at. I always wanted one of those high-end coolers because of the quality that I had heard of, but I couldn't justify the price. Then I found Polar Works. Finally, I found a company that understands quality and affordability. The Polar Works lineup is extensive and is filled with Polar cups, Polar tubs, and Polar soft coolers. What do I love about these coolers? Well, for one, the ice stays frozen for a long period of time. But they've thought of other things in their design. For example, drain speed. No one likes a slow drain after a long weekend on the trail. The Polar Lock system. You're always protecting your valuable beverages from thirsty outsiders. And there's the non-slip Polar Feet. Polar Feet will prevent sudden movement when you're on the move. There's the sweat-free material, so you don't have to worry about cleaning up puddles when you're finished with your journey. Polar tubs hold ice for such a long period of time because of the 3-inch insulated walls, the heavy-duty gaskets, and the fail-proof hinges, which guarantee a freezer-tight seal. So check out polarworks.com when you're considering your next high-quality cooler without breaking the bank. That's www.polarwerkz.com.
For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News. Our first story this week, Wisconsin researchers CWD found in soil near mineral licks. This story is from the Outdoor News website. Earlier this year, University of Illinois researchers began considering the relationship between soil characteristics and the presence of deer with chronic wasting disease. They said their findings would eventually help explain the movement of CWD across the landscape. The hope is that new research out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison will provide even more of the same. Scientists report that, for the first time, research has detected prions responsible for CWD in samples taken from sites where deer congregate. According to the story out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which conducted the study, scientists searched for prions at mineral licks, areas where deer seek out essential nutrients and minerals in the CWD endemic area across south-central Wisconsin. Out of 11 sites, 9 had detectable levels of the disease-causing misfolded proteins, and prions were found both in soil and water from the sites as well as in nearby fecal samples from one site. It is not clear if the quantity of soil-dwelling prions detected in the UW study are sufficient to infect deer, the story said, adding that the significance of prion-contaminated environments in the spread and the persistence of CWD among free-ranging deer also remains unknown. The research does help confirm long-standing suspicions that prions can accumulate in the environment in areas such as mineral licks or feeding and baiting sites where deer congregate, and scientists believe environmental reservoirs of prions could serve as an additional transmission route of CWD, which also passes between deer through direct contact. In the University of Illinois study, scientists were looking at, among other things, what happens to a patch of soil after a deer urinates on it. When infected deer urinate, defecate, or salivate, they can shed prions. When a susceptible deer comes along and licks, ingests, or inhales infected soil, it could pick up a prion, said Nora Matusfinella, veterinary epidemiologist at the Illinois Natural History Survey and the Illinois study co-author. Of the UW study, Don Waller, a professor of botany and environmental studies at UW, who researches Wisconsin deer herds but has not been involved in the study, said it's not easy to test for CWD, but this result suggests we should be looking for hotspots of CWD prions in the environment and doing all we can to cover them up so animals can't get to them. We may also want to do more testing in other animal species to see which may be vulnerable to CWD infection. Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency eyes going back to original antlerless deer rules. This story is from the Hartsville Vidette website and was reported by Larry Woody. The Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency has proposed returning to the former definition of an antlerless buck, one with antlers less than 3 inches long, and if passed, the new rule would be in effect for this fall's deer seasons. The TWRA proposal was made during last week's meeting of the Tennessee Fish and Wildlife Commission, which makes the final decision on regulations. Generally, however, the Commission supports the proposals of the TWRA, which is in charge of enforcing the game laws. The new antler rule is expected to be finalized at the Commission's next meeting, May 17th and 18th, at TWRA headquarters in Nashville. If so, it will return to the 3-inch antlerless definition that had been used for many years. That definition was changed last year, restricting the antlerless to only deer in which the antlers don't protrude above the hairline. A little buck with any visible antler, even just a nub, was considered antlered. If killed, it counted as part of the 2-buck season limit. Some hunters complained that it was difficult to discern such a barely visible antler on little button bucks and wanted to return to the 3-inch definition. Apparently their concerns were heeded by the TWRA. The reason behind last year's change in the antlerless definition was simple. The TWRA wanted to let more little spikes grow to be trophy size. Under the 3-inch rule, a hunter could and probably will be allowed to again kill a virtually unlimited number of spiked bucks since they don't count against the 2-buck limit. The limit on does, or technically antlerless deer, is 3 per day, 7 days a week throughout a season which runs from September to early January. Although obviously no hunter would kill 21 deer a week, week after week, under the law it would be legal. And likely starting this fall, little bucks will once again be permitted to be included among that very unlimited harvest. Arizona Game and Fish Department proposing changes in trail camera use. This story is from the Daily Miner website and was reported by Don Martin. If you are one of the many sportsmen in Arizona who uses trail cameras in the pursuit of your sport, stand by, for there may be changes coming and how and where they can be used. The department is going to propose to the AZGF Commission changes they felt need to be made on rules that cover the use of these devices. Trail cameras are primarily used by hunters and others to check for animals that are visiting water sources. These cameras have come a long way from when they were first introduced, and now the department feels that due to evolving technology, they need to regulate how and where they can be used. Live, real-time information can be transmitted to the owners of the cameras, who are oftentimes far away and not even in the field. The issue with the use of trail cameras involves fair chase. There are other issues with newly developed technology besides cameras. The use of drones and so-called smart rifles are also issues that are being addressed. Arizona has already outlawed the use of drones in the pursuit of wildlife as they are considered aircraft. Some restrictions that are being proposed include prohibiting cameras being placed within a quarter mile of a water source, and real-time cameras that transmit images cannot be used at all. Local sportsmen need to weigh in on these issues. Right now, nothing is set in stone on these rules, but soon there will be new rules, and once that happens, the time to comment and offer input will be gone. Curious baby deer climbs into California police car. This story is from the UPI.com website and reported by Ben Hooper. Police in California shared video of a baby deer that climbed into a patrol car and got itself temporarily stuck behind the driver's seat. The Marin County Sheriff's Office tweeted a video showing the baby deer exploring behind the driver's seat of the patrol car after police stopped to offer the small animal some assistance. The video shows officers trying to coax the fawn out from behind the driver's seat of the car. The deer eventually comes out on his own. Be sure to check out this video if you get the chance. That concludes this week's edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News. For links to the stories featured this week, please check our show notes at www.bigbuckregistry.com. If you have any ideas for future topics or have any questions about any of these topics, please email me at jim@bigbuckregistry.com. For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Thanks to Jim Keller for the Deer News. Without further ado, here is KIP Adams. KIP Adams, welcome back to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
We're psyched to have you back. I've been eager to get back to this conversation and continue on with part 2 of the Whitetail Report QDMA puts out. We've got really good response on last week's show. Lots of details and lots of little idiosyncrasies of what the whitetail world's all about, and it seems to have struck a nerve with a lot of our listeners, so I think they'll appreciate part 2.
Good deal. Well, I hope so. Well, it's a lot of exciting topics for sure, and a lot of big things out there from a hunting standpoint going on in the world. So, let's jump right in.
Okay. All right. Let's first talk about crossbow use. It's an interesting topic. Obviously, crossbows are not used in every part of the country. Specifically, you have the Northeast, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts. They're not allowed during archery season. Not to say they're not allowed during other parts of other seasons. However, they're not allowed during the archery season alone. There are some states in the Midwest, looks like South Dakota, North Dakota, looks like Minnesota, and Idaho, Nevada, certain spots they're not allowed. What's the viewpoint of some of these states about not allowing use of these? Why do they not allow it? And then there are lots of states that do. Can you kind of tell us the differences between the two states and their viewpoint?
Yeah, and crossbow use has greatly expanded over the past decade. We actually took a look at this a few years ago, and most states did not allow their use during archery season for the majority of hunters. And if you take a look today, 3/4 of the states do allow crossbows during their regular archery season or at least a portion of that archery season for the majority of the hunters. So that's a big change. So the states that you talked about, those in New England, and some of those in the West that don't allow it, they just kind of haven't come along with the rest of the states yet, because historically, almost nobody did allow them. So we've seen a huge change in regulations for crossbows during the past decade. Lots of new opportunities for hunters and expanded seasons. So, and I think it has a lot to do just with trying to continue to add hunters to our ranks. We're losing hunters at an unprecedented level. Crossbows are a great way to introduce new hunters, particularly youth hunters, but even adult onset hunters who, maybe did not come from a hunting background that are willing to try hunting. What they've seen is, a lot of them, also don't come from a shooting background. So firearms really intimidate them. However, crossbows don't. Crossbows look cool, very effective. People can become real proficient with them, in a pretty short period of time. So I am a huge bow hunter, and I spend a tremendous amount of time practicing them with my bow. And I like to do that, and I require that of myself. However, I understand that not everybody is like me. And so I would much rather have somebody who is going to try hunting be able to use something like a crossbow that's a lot easier to become proficient with when they hit the woods. And I think that's why we're seeing this big infusion of crossbow seasons, or at least the allowance of crossbows during archery seasons by states as they try to continue to add some hunters and add some more opportunity for existing hunters. And it's certainly a big help. People are taking advantage of it. So whether you want to introduce a kid or even an adult onset hunter, we're seeing that crossbows are a great first step for them, that then later they may say, hey, I want to try a vertical bow now, or I'm ready for firearm season as well. So I think because of the ease of use is why we're seeing them used so much today, more so than in the past.
Okay. Now, the states that are holding out, what are they saying? And it sounds like QDMA, in your opinion, you're in support of using more crossbows in each state. But what are the states that are holding out? What's their opinion? Why are they fighting it?
Well, we take a look at it. We're not real pro crossbow or anti crossbow or really any specific weapon. We're more so about making sure that the deer herds are managed well. Mm-hmm. And so if that can be done with crossbows, then great. We'd love to see more opportunity for people. I think most of the states that just haven't allowed them yet tend to be states whose deer populations aren't as high as many other states. Mm-hmm. So you don't need hunters killing as many, in particular, antlerless deer during the year. Many of the states that use them now are having trouble harvesting enough deer. So it's another way to get hunters afield and be able to have those hunters be more successful. But, you can take a look at New Hampshire, Maine, et cetera, where productivity of those deer herds is lower. Winter severity is worse. So you just don't have the need or even the ability to kill anywhere near the number of deer on a per acre or per square mile basis as many other states. So I think those states can continue to have very successful deer management programs, without the need for this additional weapon or additional opportunity to shoot more deer. So I think that as much as anything is why you don't see them in upper New England or the upper Midwest. Okay.
So that explains the upper Midwest and New England. I can see that. And I guess those states are banking on either the lack of archer involvement or that the archers aren't nearly as good a shot as a crossbow for the most part. But what I'm interested, even which is a little more perplexing, is why like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, why not there?
I'm not as familiar with the Southwest to know exactly the reasons there. I do know that Arizona is a little different in many respects, in lots of different regulations that they have there. I personally have never hunted in Arizona. I know Arizona's some of their deer folks real well. I guess I've never specifically asked them that question about the crossbow use, though. So I'm really not sure why in that part of the world they just tend to not like them.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to some other illegality issues, specifically trail cameras and drones. It seems like trail cameras are pretty much widely accepted, but the trail camera with the cellular feature seems to still be holding out in a couple of states, specifically my home state, New Hampshire, and it seems to be fairly widely accepted across the country and even under review in some of the southwestern state, or one southwestern state in particular. And drones, I don't think anybody's really wrapped their head around using drones for for the purposes of deer hunting. Yet there are some along the, I don't know, from Nebraska along the southern border all the way up to Pennsylvania seems to be somewhat accepted to use drones for deer scouting during deer season. What's your opinion of cell cameras or cellular game cameras and the use of drones?
I'm a big user or a big fan of cameras, and actually I started using trail cameras back in 1992 in New Hampshire when I was in graduate school, and have used them ever since. So I think that they're great for deer managers. I think they're great for the average hunter, and great for the average wildlife enthusiast. You don't have to use them to hunt. People can get so excited about being good stewards of our natural resources by using a game camera and just seeing what's in your backyard or on the public land near your house. So in general, I am a huge fan of those. At QDMA, we certainly are big proponents of fair chase hunting. So we do not support anything that gives us an unfair advantage over our wildlife that we're chasing. And I personally don't think that the game cameras do that. It's nice, I believe, that every state, with the exception of Arizona, allows regular game cameras, those that cannot text. And it's not that they don't allow it; it's under review right now. They're considering not allowing them. But the texting part, yeah, you guys there in New Hampshire are one of just a couple states that don't allow that. And even that, I disagree with that. I don't think even the texting capability gives you an unfair advantage. I do understand where that argument comes from, but just because of an animal was at a certain place, doesn't mean that you can sneak in on it to that tree or that spot or whatever and harvest it. And actually, I equate them a lot to fish finders. You have a fish finder, you can locate fish in the water. Does it give you an unfair advantage? Well, sometimes it certainly helps, but not always. You don't always just catch those fish because you see them. I think there's a lot of parallels with that and game cameras. So I'm a big fan of game cameras and hope that the use of those is not outlawed. As more and more provide the opportunities for folks to have the texting capabilities.
Right. All right. So according to your chart here, there's a lot of green here. It's under review in Arizona. It's currently illegal in Colorado and New Hampshire. And what I don't understand about New Hampshire is that it's the states that surround it in New England have all allowed it, which it seems like it's a similar deer population, similar to Maine, I would think. I'm not getting that. That doesn't make sense to me.
And just to clarify, they're legal to use during the year outside of the hunting season.
Right.
The way we ask that question, they are illegal, so hunters cannot use them during the hunting season. So if they have them, they got to take them down or disable them or whatever once hunting season arrives.
Right. So you can scout up until deer season, but again, there's this lonely old state right up in the Northeast called New Hampshire that seems to not want to allow trail camera use during hunting season. And to me, it just doesn't make any sense. Specifically, when you look at Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine, they're all okaying it. I don't know. I think we need some more peer pressure there. Anyway, that's just my opinion. All right. Moving on to the legality of drones during hunting season. Now, this topic, I think, is all over the map. I don't like drones to begin with, except for doing some videography. I'm not sure what the use of these are for hunting. What's the QDMA's opinion on these things?
We look at those as, it goes back to the fair chase part. We don't want hunters to have an unfair advantage. And we recognize that with drones, there is a much greater opportunity for an unfair advantage than there are with trail cameras and even texting trail cameras. So we certainly don't discourage the use of them outside of the hunting season or even for scouting. But once you start hunting, then that's a whole different story at that point. And I think what's interesting about the map, of who allows them and who doesn't, and just over a third of the states allow them. So a big majority of states outlaw them during the hunting season, but you try to think of it as, well, maybe the states that are real open are the ones that outlaw them, but it's kind of all over the map. Some states that are very forested allow them. Other forested states don't. Some states that are really open allow them. Other states that are real open don't. So I think that the technology of drones quickly outpaced any of the regulatory agencies looking at those. Yeah. And so there's a lot of agencies that are kind of in a reactive mode. And so because of that, some of them end up reacting to a specific example, good or bad, of drones, rather than looking at the totality of their use. And so I think there's a lot more states that are really looking at them now, taking a more serious look at, okay, let's look at all the opportunities here or channels with these and then figure out what we want to do with them. Okay. So lots of utility for them and research and management, and certainly can get some cool pictures and all that, but definitely some regulations that need to be considered with regard to how hunters are using them during a hunting season, to provide an unfair advantage to themselves.
So just so the people listening understand where the drone use is legal during deer season, starts in Nebraska, it goes south to Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, goes over through the southern border of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, and Florida, then comes up the East Coast, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, looks like, I think Maryland's okay, and Pennsylvania, I think, rounds it out.
Yeah, and you kind of get over into Kentucky's a little wing off that.
Oh, but, Kentucky, yes.
It's almost,
I see that too,
it's almost
right.
almost a little horseshoe there that allows them.
Right.
And a lot of states that do not.
Right. So all the other states either didn't provide information or are illegal. So if I didn't name it there, then hold tight. Don't use them for deer season. All right. Okay. Moving on. CWD. Talking about samples and costs. This is obviously a hot topic for QDMA. It's killing deer. It's a disease. Something that we're trying to ward off and do whatever we can to get rid of it so it doesn't affect our deer populations. Now, in order to understand this, there are some states there, and you kind of highlighted some of this in your report. Some states are testing, some states are not. The state, and here's your top 5 states that are not testing for CWD currently. And this is as of 2016. Vermont, not testing at all. Massachusetts, less than 10. North Carolina, followed by Oklahoma and South Dakota. Why aren't these states testing in a higher capacity?
Some of it is just cost. Takes a lot of money to manage CWD or to provide surveillance for it. So some just aren't willing to spend the money on it. Some of it is politically driven, where some states just are not collecting much because a lot of political ties in those states to the captive deer industry, and deer farmers are able in many cases to squelch some of the monitoring efforts of our state wildlife agencies. So at the end of the day, it's crazy that states are not testing more deer for CWD, given the potential repercussions to our free-ranging deer resource and our future herds and hunting opportunities. That states ought to be testing a whole lot more, than 0 or 10 or 50 animals a year.
Gotcha. All right, so there are some states that test routinely. Top 5 is Missouri, Texas, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Why are they testing so much?
If you take a look at those, all of those states have CWD. So additional testing is often required, where they collect more samples around where they have identified it to try to gauge how prevalent it is within the deer herd and at rate that it's spreading through the deer herd. So if a state has CWD, they tend to test at a much higher rate than a state that doesn't. Hence one of the reasons to keep CWD out of your state. So that's the biggest difference of those from the states that we talked about here a minute ago that didn't test any. All of those states have CWD.
Okay.
So unfortunately, although the first side, like Oklahoma that we talked about, and South Dakota, who are testing almost none, both of those states do have CWD within their boundaries.
Okay.
So from management perspective and QDMA's perspective, it's absolutely insane that they are not testing higher numbers.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully they'll pick up the pace here. There are some states that are increasing their testing, like they've gone full bore here, and these are not necessarily the ones that are in the top, but they're increasing their testing program. In particular, Tennessee is testing more on a percentage basis than they ever did, followed by Missouri, Minnesota, Arkansas, and Texas. What is it about CWD that's captured these states' attention and say, hey, we need more?
I think just the severity of it and truly the threat that it provides to our future deer herds. Those states get it, and they understand the importance of figuring out exactly where it is. 4 of those 5 states that have CWD, so they just have ramped up surveillance. Tennessee being the lone exception there. And kudos to the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. They don't have it, but they're doing a good job making sure that they test abundant deer throughout the state, because it's in many places around them. So they want to make sure that if they get it, they find out very, very quickly, because the sooner you can identify that it's within your borders, the better opportunity you have to minimize its spread. So, there's a lot of hats off to what the folks in Tennessee are doing to make sure that if and when it arrives, they find out about it real quickly.
And then also looking at the states with the largest decrease, it's a match to the number of states that are testing period. First and foremost, Vermont had 100% decrease, followed by Massachusetts, South Dakota, North Carolina, and Oklahoma. That list matches the top 5 states with the lowest number of CWD tested samples, period. And again, this is as of tested between 2008 and 2016. So those states, and as we mentioned, some of those states have CWD within them, so it just doesn't make any sense.
No, that's for sure. And we actually have contacted some of those agencies, and just asked, hey, why are you testing so many fewer than in the past when CWD continues to spread and grow? And some states give us a monetary answer. Some states give us a political answer, and some states just kind of dodge that question altogether, knowing that, hey, this is not good, that we have kind of dropped the ball on some of this testing. So I understand that it takes money, it takes resources, and it's unfortunate that those have to be spent on disease. But we likely have never faced anything this imminent for the future of our deer herds, over many wildlife professionals' careers. So it's a big deal. It truly is that big of a deal. So right. we need to spend time and resources working on it.
So thinking about economics and resources, I mean, there is a cost associated with this stuff. But going back to 2008 versus 2016, what's the cost per sample on average that we're looking at? And it looks like going down to Missouri, it looks like they're spending $89 per sample, testing 25,000.
Yeah, in this chart, this is a little bit misleading. Unfortunately, we did not ask this question very well to the state wildlife agencies. Okay. What we were trying to get at, Jay, was how much does it cost to actually have a sample tested? So what some states provided was, yes, it costs us $10 to have that tested, or it costs us $40 to have that tested. What other states like Missouri submitted was, hey, it costs us $89 to acquire that sample and have it tested.
Gotcha.
So that actually is a better measure of what's going on. It was our fault for not asking a better question. So that's the big difference and why there's such a wide range and sample cost. Some include time and labor to get the sample to, and some don't.
Okay. So some, like Missouri, time retrieving the sample and doing the testing, $89, but it seems like most of the testing itself is somewhere around $25, thereabouts.
That's a good average, yep.
Okay. Moving on to the 2017 deer disease update, let's talk about some other diseases other than CWD.
Yeah, hemorrhagic disease is the big one here.
Okay.
And, where you are there in New Hampshire, it's never been in your state, mostly because the vector that carries it, the little midges or the little no-see-ums just aren't there. But, it is really moving north. And I vividly remember back in the late 80s and early 90s when I was at Penn State in undergraduate school, hemorrhagic disease was literally taught to us as a disease of southern deer. Deer in the southeast got this, and that was it, because it just simply wasn't in the northeast or upper Midwest. And man, that has changed tremendously over the past 2 decades, to the point where now it is confirmed well up into New York. It's been confirmed in Ontario. So it's getting a lot closer to home for you, and I bet it's not that far in the future that you guys will start having the first cases of it in New England for certain, and in New Hampshire. Okay. But hemorrhagic disease, it's one of the most common disease of whitetail deer, and this is the one. It causes them. They have a fever, they have internal hemorrhaging, so they try to get to water sources, and it tends to be worse during droughts. And the reason for that is the actual little midges, the no-see-ums that carry the disease, tend to do best during dry years because they breed in the mud around water holes. So it's a perfect environment for them. It's a poor environment for deer. Deer end up congregating into these water areas where then these midges can infect large numbers of deer. So when we have droughts, you tend to have more hemorrhagic disease than not.
Okay.
Now, the one thing that's interesting about it is not all deer die from it. And there's a bunch of different strains of this. And that's why deer in the Southeast, they almost never die. So they develop antibodies against it, and then they're at least a little bit protected. Well, our northern deer are very naive to it. They don't have the antibodies. So when there's an outbreak in the north, our deer die like crazy because of it. So last year, though, actually was a pretty mild hemorrhagic disease year compared to what we've had over the last 5 or 6 years. The one region of the country that got hit pretty hard was a little bit of Kentucky, Tennessee, some of Ohio, and even some of Western Pennsylvania. There's a little band through there where they lost a lot of deer. Outside of that, though, most states fared pretty well from hemorrhagic disease. So let's hope that 2018 is a mild year for it as well.
Are there pockets that you would call hot spots?
It can be anywhere.
Okay.
Certainly anywhere within the range of the disease. And what's interesting is you actually, you can have an outbreak right at your place, and 5 miles down the road, or there may be none. So when you do get an outbreak, it can be really, really spotty, even in those areas. So some folks may see dead deer, and you typically find them around water areas. You may find a bunch, and just a few miles down the road, there may be none. Okay. So it's pretty spotty how it happens.
Okay. Let's talk about the New World screwworm. We heard a lot about this in the news in 2017. I think of it as a Caribbean or Florida type thing with a key deer. Is that any concern anywhere else in the country?
It's not. No, that's the first time, in 2016 when it arose in Florida, it's the first time it had been even in Florida in a long time. So 16, that was a really big deal because of the key deer, that subspecies of deer. But researchers and managers got it under control. Basically, 2017, they eradicated it, got rid of it. So I think we're in pretty good shape again from that. And the key deer seem to do okay. So, it's an endangered species. There's not all that many left. So that was the real big headline with it is, man, here's a subspecies of deer in real peril. And now they have something else that was killing them like crazy. But they seem to do okay. And we're off and running again.
Okay. What's the QDMA's opinion overall? And I assume this goes for any disease. What's your protocol or what is your recommendation to prohibit the spread of some of these diseases?
Well, we look at each on an individual basis, and we're very fortunate to have a great working relationship with some of the best disease experts in the country. The University of Georgia's Vet School is home to the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Unit. They do a bunch of the testing for many state wildlife agencies. Actually, their office is just down the road from our national office. So we rely on the information from the experts, and it's a look at each disease on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, hemorrhagic disease, it comes a little bit each year. Some years it's worse than others. Kills some deer, not others, and then it's gone. And some of those deer survive. The disease doesn't hang around at the end of the year. So that is a very different perspective than something like chronic wasting disease or CWD, which once it's there, it's 100% fatal to all deer, and there's no way to decontaminate the environment. So we look at that on a very, very different basis. But all of our support and our opinions come from the wildlife or the disease experts from SCWDIS and other wildlife institutions.
Okay, gotcha. All right, moving on, we want to talk about antler restrictions. Some states have them. Looks like a lot of states don't have any antler restrictions. Some states have antler spread restrictions. Some have a combination of both. In particular, the states that don't have them, there's New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine. Those don't have any restrictions at all. Then you go out west, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, a lot of those states north of Texas, out to the west coast, except for California and Oregon, don't have any restrictions. But you start to see antler point restrictions, Minnesota, Missouri, pretty much right down through to Texas. It skips Louisiana for some reason. All the southern states, Florida, then you come up through Tennessee. And for whatever reason, there are no antler point restrictions in Kentucky or West Virginia. It looks like Delaware, but there are antler spread restrictions in those 3 states. Can you comment about what the QDMA's opinion is about having an antler point restriction or some kind of antler restriction, and should we focus more on this or less?
Sure. We look at every antler restriction proposal on a case-by-case basis, and we ask there's a 3-part criteria. 1, will this proposal, this antler restriction, protect the majority of 1.5-year-old deer while still allowing the majority of deer that are 2.5 and older to be eligible for harvest? And because if it passes that, we go to the next one. Will it be objectively monitored by the state wildlife agency who's implementing this? Meaning, are they collecting data? Are they measuring the impacts of it? If it passes that, the last one is this proposal supported by the majority of hunters? And that last part is really important, because you can have the best proposal in the world, but if the majority of hunters don't support it, it will fail. And we've seen that numerous times with lots of deer hunting regulations. So if it passes all 3 of those criteria, then the QDMA will support that restriction. Or if you take a look at what's going on in the country right now, and the map that you were referencing, 24 states, so half of the states in the lower 48, have some type of antler restriction implemented by their state wildlife agency. And of those, half of those states, so 12 of them, that restriction is statewide for at least one of the bucks in the bag limit. So some states have a restriction that's statewide. Others have a restriction that's just in certain parts of the state. So there's lots of hunters today hunting under those type of regulations. To break it down a little further, the most popular antler restriction that states use is an antler point restriction. So 16 states, so there's 24 states total that have them. 16 of those states use an antler point restriction. And that's the most popular kind, because it's very simple for hunters to tell. This deer either has 3 points or 4 points on an antler, or whatever the restriction is. And it's very easy for state wildlife agencies to enforce that. So that's why more states use that than anything else.
Gotcha.
3 states use an antler spread restriction. The distance in between each antler has to have a minimum antler spread to make that deer eligible for harvest. The advantage of that is it's more biologically sound than an antler point restriction, because it does a better job dividing between 1.5-year-old bucks and bucks that are at least 2.5 or older. So that's why some states use that. And hunters judge that based on how wide those antlers are, relative to the deer's ears. And then you also have 5 states that use some type of combination of restrictions, meaning a deer has to meet one of 2 or 3 criteria. So some states have a deer has to have a minimum number of points or a minimum antler spread, or it can have a minimum antler spread or a minimum main beam length. So those are good because they're more flexible, and you can do a really, really good job breaking or separating bucks that are just 1.5 versus older deer, and give hunters an opportunity, to use a couple different guidelines to help them determine if this is a deer that meets legal requirements or not. So
Gotcha.
There was a lot of talk about these, 5 and 10 years ago. You don't hear as much talk about them today, partly because so many hunters today just willingly practice quality deer management and just willingly pass bucks that are just 1.5 years old, even if they are legal to shoot. They want the opportunity to hunt something that's a little bit older and provide a different experience. So these are still very popular with the hunters within the states that have them, but they're not talked about nearly as much as they were a few years ago.
Thinking about just the antler point restriction, and this is just a quirky thought of mine, but I don't know what the antler point or the most common antler point restriction is. I don't know if it's like 3 points or better. But thinking about a mature spike, I mean, how often does that happen? Probably pretty rare, but you couldn't shoot the big mature spike if the antler point restriction is 3, right? It's not based off of age of buck. It's based off of points. So what are you seeing for the most common antler point restriction requirement?
It's been a while since I've looked specifically at whether the majority require 3 points or 4 points. I believe that the majority require 3 points, but that varies a lot based on where you are. So, for example, some states, the majority of yearling bucks will have 6 or 7 points. So a 3-point restriction, would not protect those. So you need a 4-point restriction. In other places like Vermont, like Northwest Florida, the vast majority of yearling bucks are spikes. So you only need to have a 2-point restriction, to protect the majority of that yearling class. So with any restriction, the important part of that is that the managers collect data from the local area there and then use that to establish what the restriction should be so that it meets that first criteria that I said by protecting the majority of bucks that are 1.5, while making sure that those that are 2.5 and older, the vast majority of those are eligible for hunters to shoot.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's take a little coffee break. And when we come back, we'll pick up where we left off and talk more about deer trends with QDMA's Director of Conservation, Kip Adams. How many of you have eaten a vine-ripened, juicy tomato picked fresh from the garden? How does that compare to the bland, pale, hard tomatoes that you've seen at the grocery store during the winter? No comparison, right? Well, if the coffee that you typically drink comes from a can or whatever was on sale that week, you owe it to yourself to give Hunter's Blend a try. Just like store-bought tomatoes don't hold a candle to the fresh ones from your garden, store-bought coffee doesn't hold a candle to select specialty-grown, fresh roasted coffee. Store-bought coffee, and most coffee for that matter, comes from cheap, inferior-grade coffee beans because they're cheaper. Farmers in Nicaragua and Thailand select their top beans, which are then purchased direct by the folks at Hunter's Blend Coffee, where they custom roast beans in their Central Ohio roastery to produce a premium-grade coffee. Just like that first bite of a ripe, juicy tomato, one sip of fresh brewed Hunter's Blend coffee is all that it will take for you to realize that you've never really had coffee until now. Go to huntersblendcoffee.com to order some today. And as always, let your local hunting store know about Hunter's Blend Coffee so they can carry it in their store. Hunter's Blend Coffee. We're hunters too. And now back to our conversation with Kip Adams, Director of Conservation at the QDMA. Let's move on to food plots. Food plots, obviously lots of people get into food plots. There are some that don't. Some parts of the country don't care as much as other parts. But in your report, you comment that there are the top 5 management practices in the survey. Number 1 was food plots at 81%. Number 2, mineral sites, 49%. Number 3, timber management, 45%. Number 5, plant management, 42%. And then feeders, 39%. Can you break down what all those mean? Can you give me your overall opinion about food plots in general? And are they important and are they supported by the QDMA?
Sure. The food plots can be very valuable from a wildlife management perspective, and it can be great for getting people introduced into managing habitat. And we look at it as, you can really break deer habitat down into 3 components, a forested component, an early successional habitat, or kind of that old field component, and then food plots. And we are big believers in that you should manage your forests and your early successional habitat to carry the deer herd, and then use food plots as a supplement on top of that. Do not try to carry a deer herd based on food plots alone, because in most years you will be sorely troubled with that, from droughts or too much rain or whatever. So, but food plots have a big opportunity to introduce people to good land management. And a lot of people today that do a great job managing woods and old fields started by planting food plots. So it's a great first step into being a good habitat manager. Specifically, the survey you were talking about, Southwick and Associates, which is a top natural resource survey company, was surveying, hunters about what they do. And amazingly, they found that only a third of hunters do anything to manage habitat. So, 2 of 3 hunters said they're not managing any habitat at all, either their own land or helping friends' land or helping people or that. So of the third that did do something to improve habitat, by far, the vast majority, food plots was what they were doing. As you noted, at 81%. So more people do that than anything else, I think, because it's fun, because they can provide great places to view deer or shoot deer. People like getting their hands dirty, and in most part, there's a lot more information available, and certainly a lot more marketing done on food plots and food plot supplies than teaching people how to, manage early successional habitat or manage forested areas. So at QDMA, we spend a bunch of time and resources teaching people how to make sure they can manage the woods and are in the old fields. But we certainly recognize the value and the affinity for food plots. So we see them as a good thing. And as long as they're kept in perspective for the total land management that folks are doing.
Gotcha. All right. Let's move on to hunter numbers and hunter spending declines. If we are trying to preserve our hunting heritage here as hunters today for future generations, this is a disturbing situation we're in with declining hunters. The number of hunters that are out there is obviously on the down slope. You did a survey, and most hunters, 80% of them, hunt big game. Some hunt migratory birds and small game. What's the overall situation right now with regards to hunter numbers, and what can we do to reverse this trend?
Yeah, and unfortunately, hunter numbers are on the decline, and a pretty sharp decline. This is not surprising. State wildlife agencies have been predicting this for the past decade, looking at license sales and how that was changing. So we have fewer hunters today, partly because we are more urbanized than we've ever been. Historically, rural kids made up the majority of new hunters. And today there's just fewer people that live in rural America and more people that live in and around cities and suburbs. And so hunting just isn't a natural progression for them, as it was certainly for me and, and many people of my generation. So we have a big problem, I think, on our hands, partly because we are certainly losing hunters. And some people say, well, so there's fewer people in the woods. What's the big deal? Well, the reality of it is the vast majority of our wildlife management programs are funded primarily by hunters, hunter license dollars and what the supplies that hunters buy. So New Hampshire's a perfect example. You don't get any money from the general tax fund to manage wildlife. It all comes from the hunting industry, or primarily the hunting industry. So as there are fewer and fewer hunters, there's less money in that, and there's less money for managing wildlife. And it's not just the animals that we shoot. Our state wildlife agencies manage all game and non-game, also all of the things we can't shoot, all the songbirds, all the non-game mammals. There's less money for managing all of them as well. So fewer hunters is a really bad thing for the future of our wildlife management programs, primarily because how they were established and how they currently, the vast majority of them are funded.
Okay. So hunters spend money when they hunt and go on trips, and it's not always going on a trip, but sometimes they always need to spend money on equipment, it seems. Now, in your survey, if we break down the pie chart here, 48% of where money goes went to equipment, but we've got some other categories that you broke it down into. You had 13% to other expenditures, and I want to get back to that in a minute. Only 3% to licensing and fees. I think that's interesting. I didn't realize that of all the dollars that hunters spend, that the licensing and fees was the lower piece. Trip costs, 11%, food, 10%, transportation, 13%, lodging, 2%. With the licensing and fees being such a small percentage, where are we going to get to? I mean, these are your management institutions, right? Getting these licensing and fees. Is that a concern of yours?
Yeah, it's a huge concern, and that's why there are many state wildlife agencies that have tried to increase the price of hunting licenses in the recent past, and in many places the legislatures actually hold the power over that, and it is unbelievable how difficult it is to get even a $1 or a $2 increase in a hunting license price, because legislators don't want to see increasing fees, and I understand that. I don't want to pay more either. But at the end of the day, you have hunters that complain, well, I can't pay $20 for a hunting license next year, if I'm only paying $19 this year, but yet, they're out there buying, an expensive truck and a new boat and a new rifle. So we have to understand, look, if you want to have deer and turkeys and bear and to shoot in the future, we need to pay for that. And the two main ways to do that are, in many cases, we can spend a few extra bucks on our hunting licenses because, as you see here, hunting license fees are a very small portion of how this stuff is funded.
Right.
Or we need a broader funding base. So, it's crazy to think that as a hunter, you go and hunt and you may watch songbirds while you're doing that, and you're paying for that. Whereas a non-hunter may go, watch songbirds, may walk the same trail you did or drive down the same road you did to do all that, but pay nothing for it.
Right.
So that's a problem, and it's becoming a bigger problem given there are fewer hunters paying the bills. So we really need to take a look at trying to do something else to make sure that our wildlife agencies are funded enough that they can continue to manage and protect our wildlife species.
Gotcha. All right. Let's talk specifically about deer hunter numbers. We talked about hunter numbers. Let's talk about deer hunter numbers. And you broke down some of these highlights. The 5 states with the lowest number of deer hunters. And this kind of is breaking down by geographic region and population. But Rhode Island ranks number 1 with the lowest number of deer hunters at 9,000 as of 2016. Followed by Nevada, 18,000, Wyoming at 27,000, New Mexico at 31,000, and Connecticut at 48,000. Connecticut's a small state. That's a lot, but that seems to me like a lot of hunters compared to Rhode Island, right? I mean, that seems like...
That's for sure. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Rhode Island's not all that much smaller, but, they have, less than 20% of the hunters that Connecticut has.
How is that possible?
Well, I guess just a lot more people in Connecticut shooting deer, I think.
All right.
But, yeah, what's interesting, if you take a look at this page compared to what we just talked about with overall hunter numbers, the overall hunter numbers come from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, from their surveys. The deer hunter numbers came to us straight from each state wildlife agency, and this is from license sales. And what this shows is that actually over the past decade, the number of deer hunters in these states is about the same. Certainly some states have fewer or more, but overall, the total number of deer hunters has stayed relatively constant over the last decade. While the total number of hunters has dropped like crazy over the last decade, the number of deer hunters has stayed about the same. So what that shows us is that there's a lot fewer people out there hunting other species, whether it's waterfowl, turkey, small game, etc. Our deer hunter ranks have stayed about the same. So we haven't seen as big of a decline in that. But overall, fewer hunters is not good for us a bit. Deer hunters seem to be hanging on a little better than hunters for most other species.
Now that's interesting right there. I mean, that we hear our hunter numbers are declining, which is disturbing in and of itself. However, deer hunter numbers are staying moderately the same. It's like they're sideways trend. They're not really changing. That's the part you don't hear, and that's why we're talking about this right now.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, that at QDMA we want to make sure that the people do understand and be able to bring this information to them, because, that's not a story that you normally hear or have access to that data and share. So we think it's important for hunters to realize that.
Gotcha. All right, just finishing up some of these highlights. Top 5 states with the highest number of deer hunters. And again, this kind of makes sense geographically. Texas, number 1, 738,713. Pennsylvania, I wouldn't necessarily have guessed this, but I guess deer hunting's popular in Pennsylvania, 700,000 deer hunters. Wisconsin, 642,000. Minnesota, 600,000. I don't know if I would have recognized that one. Michigan, 586. I can see Michigan for sure. Can you comment about some of those? And I mean, obviously it's geographical, but some of these ones aren't necessarily the biggest states, but they have a lot of hunters.
Oh, that's for sure. And Pennsylvania is a perfect example. Pennsylvania is not even close to being, one of the top 5 biggest states in the country, but to be number 2 on the list, she talks, to the hunting culture in Pennsylvania and just the tradition that we have here. And, some states, they joke and say that there's a hunter behind every tree. In Pennsylvania, it's almost legitimately 2 hunters behind every tree. So it's being my home state, I think it's pretty cool that we are that high on the list. Some look at it and say, man, I wish we had a lot fewer hunters. I don't look at it that way at all. I look at it as, hey, we're lucky that we have a bunch of hunters. We certainly need them for our hunting ranks. And but certainly provides different opportunities and different challenges when it comes deer season or turkey season. But fortunately, Pennsylvania has a lot of public land, so we can spread some hunters out pretty good.
Gotcha. All right. So we've got this next stat is interesting because it talks about the largest increase percentage in the last 10 years. And these are the top 5 states. Tennessee had a 35% increase. Texas had a 28% increase. Georgia 21%. Idaho 17%. Oklahoma 16%. So you've got some states that are growing year over year over the 10-year time frame. Can you explain why some of these states are increasing? And specifically, Idaho is interesting.
Yeah, I don't know specifically about Idaho why that is. For some of the others, I think it's a combination of a few different factors. One is those states have realized the need to really actively promote hunting, and so some of them have great marketing campaigns where they're really pushing the opportunities that the folks have to go to the woods. So that plays into it. Expanded seasons, again, like with crossbow use and other things, are very inviting for non-hunters to be able to get started. More youth opportunities than we've had in the past, so it brings a lot of youth hunters in. So I think what you see those states doing is a combination of many of those factors that I just mentioned, and they're doing a good job reaching target audiences to get people out to the woods and get them to try hunting.
Okay. Now, in contrast to that, we have the 5 states with the largest decrease over the last 10 years. Starting with North Dakota, they've dropped 30%, followed by Vermont at 20%, Colorado 17%, Virginia 16%, West Virginia 15%. And in particular, I'm looking at North Dakota ranking the highest, and their brother or sister to the south, South Dakota, they dropped by 13%. What's going on in the Dakotas?
Part of North Dakota is there's not a whole lot of deer in that state compared to what we have in the east. So in many cases, it's very difficult to get in a deer license to be able to go deer hunting. For somebody in the east, think it's crazy. You just go and just buy your license and just get your deer tag while you're there. But it can be very difficult in North Dakota for even a resident to be able to get a deer tag on an annual basis. So that certainly plays into them. It's very hard to get people to be able to hunt if they can't get a license and go hunting. So I think that is a big part of what we're seeing for that big drop in North Dakota.
Okay. All right, let's move on to carcass tag requirements. This is interesting because you hunt multiple states. You realize, hey, I don't even have to tag it here. I don't have to bring it to a check station. I just call it in. 1-800-GOT-1. There are a bunch of different methodologies to keeping count of some of these things in different states. Can you talk about why different states have different requirements for tagging and checking in deer, and what are the concerns, or what is some of the issues going on around the country?
Sure. This, what we found through the survey is that about 3/4 of the states do require to physically tag that carcass, and it really comes down to being pretty regional. And if you take a look at the map, if you're in the southeast, you don't have to tag a deer. If you're anywhere else, just about, you do. So this has as much cultural basis as it does biological basis. And the two anomalies here, as you can see in the southeast, nobody requires it in that big glob. And actually, South Carolina just started last year requiring it. And folks in South Carolina, the hunters and the DNR, neither of them like it. In the Midwest, Wisconsin is the only one that does not require it. And they just switched theirs last year to not require it for the first time. And nobody there likes it. It's not required. So this really goes back to, like how you were brought up in hunting, and if where you grew up, if you had to tag a deer, it seems really weird if suddenly you don't have to anymore. So our perspective on it is, as long as that agency can tie a specific deer back to a specific hunter, QDMA is fine with that. In many cases, it's very easy if you have a tag. But Georgia's a perfect example. When you get your hunt license, you don't get tags for that. You just have to write in on your license, each day that you harvested one of those deer, and you can call it in and get a confirmation number. So they still can, if you get caught by a game warden, they can check to see if you have checked in this deer or not. So today, where so many people can buy a license online and order it online, it's very different from the past where you had to go to the store, get your license, and they physically gave you your tags. Today, we want to be able to do this from afar. Hey, I'm hunting over there. Let me just get it online and be done. So it becomes a lot harder to actually ship, physical tags or whatever. So I predict in the future, we will start seeing fewer states actually require this. But for today anyway, it's definitely as much culturally based as it is biologically needed.
Gotcha. Okay. We just talked about declining hunter numbers. You've done a survey in some states. Actually, of the states that you surveyed, 32 of 41 per state. 32 of 41 states, 78% have new hunter programs. Some of them have volunteer programs. Declining hunter participation, as it reads here, is one of the single most important issues impacting deer hunting and management today. Where are we seeing these volunteer programs? Where are we seeing new hunter initiatives?
I think it's great, particularly the new hunter initiatives, and a lot of states have them. And this is a direct result out of fewer hunters, and then realizing the need for such programs to get more folks involved. Historically, people were getting involved because they wanted to, because it was the most natural thing in the world. That's not the case today. So it almost takes something like these programs to get folks the opportunity to try hunting or be exposed to it and get started. So I'm a big fan of these new hunter programs, and I'm really glad to see that the vast majority of states do, in fact, have those.
Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is venison donation state by state. This is fascinating because we always hear that hunters contribute a lot of venison, but these are the hardcore numbers. Breaking this down, top 5 states with the most pounds of venison donated 2016 to 2017. Virginia leads the way with 283 pounds of venison, followed by Missouri at 198, Tennessee at 147,000, Iowa 137, Pennsylvania 110. That's amazing. So hunters continue to contribute meat to food programs, and not to mention the stuff they're bringing home. So this stuff doesn't go to waste. I think this is a really key point.
No, I think this is very important, and we have actually really stepped up our game to try to better monitor this. Many states don't have a very good feel for how much venison is donated, so we have a couple actually new 5-year goals to share 20 million venison meals. That's just QDMA members, and to donate like 40 million venison meals. So to do that, we rely on our members in these different states to track this better and to push the state wildlife agencies to then also better track it and better promote it to people. And because there's a lot of deer that get shot that could be used for needy families. There's a lot that are shared with friends and family and that, but there's a lot of others out there that could use some more of this. So, man, as hunters, what a great public image for ourselves to let non-hunters realize, we're feeding people that need some food. So that's pretty powerful.
Yep. Very, very powerful stuff. All right, let's talk about some deer management plans before we wrap up. Which states have deer management plans? Which ones have been updated? Which ones haven't had any plan or haven't been updated in the last 10 years? And then I want to get into a little bit about what QDMA's deer management goals are coming up.
We were a little surprised to see that only 59% of the states have a published deer management plan. We look at it as this is your biggest resource. You have more deer hunters than anybody else. You absolutely should have a published deer management plan that is transparent to the public, that the public had an opportunity to provide information for, that protects the state wildlife agency. It allows the hunters know that they're partners in this and that the agency is doing a good job. So it's crazy that all states don't have a published deer management plan. So if you take a look at this, so this really shakes out regionally as well. The vast majority of the states in the northeastern U.S. do have plans and use those very well. Only about half of the states in the Midwest or the Southeast have plans, which is just crazy. And almost nobody in the western U.S. does. So the Northeast region definitely leads the way with regard to published plans.
Gotcha. You mentioned in this report that there's some lawsuits that occur from time to time relative to deer management. Can you point us in the right direction about what that's all about?
Sure. Some agencies are taken to task by stakeholders or over either some regulations that they have or the way that they manage deer. The Pennsylvania Game Commission has been sued or by a group in Pennsylvania over potential mismanagement of the deer resource. That was found to be completely wrong, and Pennsylvania Game Commission was shown that what they were doing was a good job. The Missouri Department of Conservation was sued by a deer farmer, claiming that they did not have authority, over some of the regulations that they had for captive deer, and so there's not a whole lot of lawsuits like that, but that's a big deal to be able to, to take your state wildlife agency to court, and in some cases to the Supreme Court. So wow. There's not a lot of that, but when that happens, it's obviously a big time and resource drain for our agencies, and time that they would be a lot better spent managing deer and habitat.
Gotcha. Talking about deer management, QDMA, obviously, their main focus is deer management, and your recommendations based off, and I'm going to listen to you tell us about your deer recommendations or management recommendations. You say that deer management is not one size fits all. what's the formula here?
I think that it's one of the cool things about managing deer is that, if you could just manage them the same way everywhere they live, it would be really boring, and nobody would want to be a deer biologist or a deer manager. So you can take into account where deer are. You can take in the annual precipitation, winter severity, hunting culture, amount of agriculture in an area, amount of forest in an area, mix all that stuff together and come up with a really good way for your location to manage those deer. And but there are a couple of overriding goals that I think can be applied anywhere. And we certainly encourage agencies to have goals that relate to deer herd health, because it doesn't matter if you're in Maine or Florida or New Mexico. You can measure deer herd health in your area and know if the deer are healthy or not. So we think everybody should be using herd health. Every state should be monitoring the health of the habitat and using that. Every state should be using some measure of hunter opportunity. And we feel that some state or the state should be using a measure of deer and human conflicts, to help minimize those to the large part. Gotcha. But if you really take a look at those health issues, provide an opportunity for hunters, at the end of the day, you can have a really good deer management program.
Gotcha. Excellent. Well, I think we've covered a lot of content here, Kip, and I think we need to have you back maybe a third time somewhere in the future to talk about your Deer Steward program and all the other QDMA certification programs that you have. Fabulous program. I really appreciate what you guys are doing there. If we have more questions, or if we've raised more questions during our talk, or we want to get a copy of this report, how can we reach out to you, and how can we get this report?
You can go right to our website and get this. You can go right to qdma.com and find our annual whitetail reports. This is the 10th year that we've done this, and all of those reports are available there. They're all free downloads, so anybody can go and grab them.
Very cool. And how do we get to you if we have a specific question?
Folks are welcome to email me at kadams, that's KADAMS, at qdma.com. Or they're welcome to call me. And my office number is 814-326-4023. I talk to folks from across the country on a daily basis, and I'm happy to talk to anybody regarding information from our whitetail report or anything else deer related.
That's so cool, Kip. Thank you so much for coming back. I've really enjoyed the last two conversations that we've had. We've gone deep. I really love the report. Please keep putting out this report annually. It's really fascinating subject matter. And thanks for stepping back into Big Buck Registry Studios.
All right. It's good talking to you, Jay. You're welcome. You have a great day.
Thanks to Kip Adams for joining us over the last couple of weeks and going step by step through that QDMA whitetail report. It's really a fascinating read if you like stats and see where the deer trends are and where the hunter trends are and what different states are doing and how they're managed and different legality issues, and just trying to figure out which states shoot the biggest deer, which states have the smallest deer. And it's really just an overall synopsis and snapshot of where we are today in Deer America, really. It's free. You can get it online if you want to see all the nitty-gritty. We just touched on a lot of the highlights of the report. But for guys like me and you and gals that dig this kind of stuff, it's a must-have in your catalog of things to read this year. So thanks again to Kip for walking us through that. Dusty, do we have a Chubby Tines tip of the week?
Yeah, I do, Jay, and it's,
The Chubby Tines tip of the week is sponsored by Morse's Sporting Goods. Firearms, used bows, used bows, located at 85 Kentucky Falls Road in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Give Jim a call at 603-464-3444, morsessportinggoods.com. Your dollars go further in New Hampshire. There's no sales tax. Morse's Sporting Goods.
Trail cameras are starting to come out, and I'm going to say it's one that I talked about a long time ago, and I'd like to refresh on that just by talking about angles of your trail camera. And a lot of people put them waist high, just chest high, somewhere in that general area for your deer, and sometimes that's not always the best choice. If you got a tree that you can, carry a little aluminum stepladder in and get up just a little bit higher and get you a wedge and angle that trail camera down onto the deer as they pass by so that flash is not right in their face. Even though you may be using red flash, or a black flash, there's always some kind of illumination. And then big mature bucks are going to pay attention to that. And even though they're just growing velvet now, just in the starting stages of the antler growth, it's still a good practice to get into, to get that camera placed up in the tree on a little bit of an angle and just get that aerial photo down onto the deer versus letting it flash right in their face. Because, 9 times out of 10, big mature buck's going to pick up on that camera and walk right around it every time.
Very good, man. That's very smart. As usual, you deliver something very intelligent to the Chubby Tines Tip of the Week. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Dusty, where can we find you when you're not hanging out here in the studios with me?
Shoot me an email, dusty@bigbuckregistry.com. You can look me up on Instagram and Twitter @ChasingAntler, Facebook.com/Chubby Tines Outdoors. Jay, where can the people reach out to you when you're not on the mic?
Likewise, you can shoot me an email, jay@bigbuckregistry.com, and you can visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Twitter, which is twitter.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Instagram, instagram.com/bigbuckregistry, and YouTube, which is youtube.com/bigbuckregistry. On YouTube, you can listen to all of our podcasts in their entirety. As far as videos are concerned, it's a boring video, but the audio content is there, so you can actually listen to our podcast. You can also listen to all of our live shows that we've done on Thursday nights when we do them, and we've gone back and re-interviewed a lot of our previous guests we had on the show just to put a face to a voice, let's put it that way. You can always listen to our show on other places as well, not just YouTube. We're found on Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. And if you would like to submit a buck to our page for consideration and be featured on our page in front of 250,000 diehard deer hunting fans, all you have to do is go to bigbuckregistry.com/mybuck, and all of the instructions will be right there. I think that's pretty much everywhere we're at. I think that's a wrap, Dusty.
That's a whole lot of big buck, Jay.
Sure is. I'm Jay Scott.
I'm Dusty Phillips.
And this is the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. We'll see you next week.